just for a bit of history, it's my 4th year as principal of Harkaway Hills College, a new school set up in Melbourne under the PARED model. I'll speak a little bit about that in a moment. I do have to acknowledge Frank Monagle, the founding principal, who set in place a lot of the things I'm going to speak about today, and I'm carrying on his legacy here. Hopefully you can hear me all. With all the sirens, I'll try and raise my voice
a little bit. It's a police state, Mary, so you've got to put up with that.
It's a police state. Good old Victoria. I have been pleasantly, on that note, I've been pleasantly surprised by how well we can work with the Victorian curriculum. So our school has chosen to use the Victorian curriculum, but heavily enriched, I would say. So I'm going to be very practical again, and thank you very much, Fiona, for giving a little bit of a background understanding of how we can build on the current systems. So we are very much building on the current system, and I'm going to break it down very practically. So hopefully it's useful. I'm by no means, I'm not an expert, I'm just demonstrating what we're doing, and I'm very happy to take your questions and comments as well. So just so you understand the PARED model, PARED has been around in Sydney for 40 years. It stands for Parents for Education. It's been around in Melbourne for 7 years. So Harkaway Hills College, which is boys and girls foundation to year 2. And girls only from grade 3. So we're currently up to grade 7, even though the long-term plan is to be grade 12. This year, Listerfield Lake College started for boys. So the boys start with us for the co-ed years, and then they move to Listerfield Lake College, and Trent Thomas, the headmaster, is over here as well. So he also, while our curriculum is very much aligned, there are still some differences as well, because we start to adapt the curriculum for the girls and the boys. So those who are running boys' schools, for example, will be useful to talk to Trent about that. And we have started a kinder. When I talk about our model, you'll see that so much is done in the early years. So before they even begin school, there's a lot of work that needs to go into helping children have an open mind to a classical education. So we've started a 4-year-old program this year, and we're opening a bigger kinder. Ultimately, it'll be a 3 and 4-year-old. So we're going to have the full spectrum, which is really exciting, but a lot of work as well. And we're growing very fast, so it's definitely clear that parents are seeking this out in Melbourne. There's not too many other options at the moment, and families are moving from all over Melbourne to come and benefit from our education. Now, I'm going to be simplifying how we operate things. So it might be a little bit simple. I did need to present this to families when we were launching our high school, so they could understand what we're on about. There's a lot of misunderstandings. I think some people want the kids to be reading Homer straight away, but they forget to have, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of patience, a lot of working with us. There's also, I guess, a lot of perceptions that if there's too much structure, the children are not having fun. So we need to have a lot of communication with parents and say, no, the structure that we put in place, there's a lot of fun around it as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're doing that. But what you'll see is a theme that will pop up. We partner with parents. That's all the PARED schools prioritise parents. If we're not educating parents in the way we are going to educate their children, we're not going to get that support, as I mentioned. So I will be getting emails like, why aren't they reading Treasure Island yet? It's like, well, your child is in grade 1. We need to do some decoding first and teach them fundamental skills. Educating for character. So virtue education, which we were lucky enough to hear from Paul earlier this morning. That was a really good introduction to the Virtue program that we run, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. It's something that's additional to the curriculum, so that's not part of the Victorian curriculum. It's something we've intentionally added to the timetable. Striving for excellence. Now that's important because we really want children to see that they are here to use a term that's, I guess, a bit religious, but they're sanctifying what they're doing. It's more than them. I guess a more secular way of saying it is that they need to be service-oriented in what they're doing. So doing their work well, studying for an exam might seem like a hard thing for a grade 7 student to do, but there's a bigger picture there. They're learning habits and they're learning to use their education for service for others. And these themes are going to come up. Now I will just mention that we're not up to year 11 and 12 yet. So that question earlier about how this works with VCE here in Victoria, that's still a work in progress, so I can't answer for that. I will say though, I myself was a Pyred student in Sydney. I don't want to give away my age, but I've been around in the Pyred system for a while. And we did the mainstream HSC in New South Wales, and I think this foundation from prep, from the foundation year to grade 10, set us up so that we could encounter the texts that everyone else had to do in year 11 and 12 with a lot more clarity. So it wasn't a problem. By year 10 and year 11, you've already got that foundation there. So I think it would be problematic for students moving into a school for year 11 and 12 and they haven't got this foundation. But if you can work really hard on building a classical education and virtue education from foundation to grade 10, the kids are able to manage the year 11 and 12 curriculum. That being said, we're still working on how to improve that. One thing I will say though is that, this is a quote directly from the Victorian Curriculum website. They say it's about knowledge and skills required for students for lifelong learning. That's what we want, lifelong learning. Social development and informed citizenship, to echo what Fiona said, that's what we want to. So there's a lot of scope that we can do within the curriculum. And it incorporates the Australian curriculum as well, so even if you're from other states, I'm sure there's very similar aspects you can take from this. I will just say for those registering new schools, it is actually manageable to work within the system. It's very manageable, even in Victoria. So I've actually, as I said, been very pleasantly surprised. But we've chosen to work with the Victorian curriculum for several reasons. Obviously there's a certain level of simplicity when it comes to registration and your cyclical reviews, which can't be ignored. But there is something bigger than that. The students who graduate from our school will be most likely in mainstream universities, unless they're lucky enough to go to Campion, which will only ever be a small percentage. They will be in mainstream workplaces, and more than likely they'll be doing the mainstream year 11 and 12 VCE. And they need to have the same, they need to understand how to work within the system. So we're teaching them that from a young age, and they do need to be prepared for the world. And yes, I know that the skills that they often say are going to be made redundant. A lot of the skills that are in the curriculum, they're probably going to be redundant by the time they leave. But it's more than that. It's about taking it to the next level. So we've decided to apply the lessons of a classical education, but in the middle of this world, this system that we're using at the moment. So one thing that is important to remember is that for independent schools, the curriculum doesn't specify your pedagogy. It doesn't specify what texts you choose from foundation to grade 10. It doesn't determine time allocations for subjects. It does set minimums, but you can build on that. It doesn't specify content. It doesn't decide your school culture. So it targets skills. It sets a minimum standard, which is a good thing because you want to know that children are reaching certain benchmarks. But you have control of everything else. So when you think about that, there's a lot of scope there. It's not impossible at all. Now, please forgive the imagery. It's a bit simple, but I am going to use a very, I guess, eye-roll imagery of a tree because now I think I've missed a slide. Oh no, that's okay. I'm missing a slide. So what I'd like you to imagine is the Victorian curriculum on its own, I see, is just the tree trunk. No roots, not much fruit, not much goal. So we're adding to this tree trunk. So we're starting from the roots, which is working with parents, applying the virtues, striving for excellence, teaching children to strive for excellence. We're adding the goal, which is the sun, seeking what is good, true and beautiful. So that's the goal. We want them to be able to reach something greater than just learning for the sake of learning. And then the watering can there is that we add a sprinkling of classical education. And then only then will you see the fruit. But a lot of the time we want to see the fruit straight away, but we're not spending the time to build the root structure. We're not watering it with rich texts, with rich subjects. So forgive the imagery, but it does help flesh it out a little bit. Now, I do think that a lot of the time the education doesn't have that deeper goal. It's just teaching skills to get a job. But that's, as we've heard this morning, not the purpose of education. If you're going to teach skills to get a job, they should just probably leave school and get a job. That's where you learn skills. We're giving them something deeper. We're helping them grow in their freedom. Because if we don't give them a solid education when they're younger and build this root structure and help them bear fruit in that sense, they're not going to be truly free. We heard this morning, if kids can't read properly or can't write properly, they're not going to be able to read. They're not going to be able to be lifelong learners. We've taken away some of that freedom. So the ultimate aim, as I said, is what's good, true and beautiful. And I'm going to show you a shot of our school. It's beautiful. That's a bit of an old shot, but we didn't intentionally. We're surrounded by rural landscapes. That's not possible for everyone. Those who are starting new schools, it's really important to remember this environment has to be beautiful. One of the virtues the children learn is the virtue of awe. So to take in what's around them, in the world around them, and a beautiful environment actually is adding to this rich education. So a lot of the time, schools, because of resourcing, they let the buildings get decrepit, and that's really sad, and sometimes it's out of our control. But when you're looking forward and starting from the beginning, you have to remember that beauty, doing things well, is actually adding to their education. And of course, we have the privilege of having our own chapel, so the faith education is part of that, so they can see, there is truth, there is goodness, there is beauty in everything we do, and that's a shot from our school chapel, which, for those who haven't been a while, has added a few details there, but it's growing and adding, so that's really important that we always remember that's the goal. And when we make decisions about the curriculum, I'm always thinking, okay, is this going to lead the children to what is good, true and beautiful? So I'm going to talk about the root structure now. Now this, I know, will be difficult for those who work in current school systems where you don't have that structure, but in your own classrooms there are ways you can start building these important root structures. So the first thing is partnering with parents. So we know that parents are the primary educators of their own children. I say that as an assumption, not everyone knows that. I'm assuming everyone in this crowd knows that. I'll just explain. Before the school even begins, there's been, children have learned virtue and faith, and they've learnt an appreciation for reading, appreciation for nature, a thirst for knowledge. That all comes from the home. And so we cannot truly implement a classical education at school if we're not getting support from the families at home. We do actually send home virtue homework, which the parents do with the children. And when I speak to parents at the start of the year, as I do, and I speak to staff as well, I say, when we are setting goals for virtues, you need to be working on them too, not just the children, which can be very hard sometimes. Hard for us as well, for us adults. Last term, the virtue was fortitude, and it was the first term 3 we've had in 3 years, and we were so tired, and it was such a good virtue to work on, because we had to set the example for the children who are losing their resilience a little bit. So I would always, when you have the opportunity to talk to families, no matter what discipline you work in, let them know it's really important that they go for walks, that they read aloud, that they choose beautiful texts. Maybe occasionally choose an old movie instead of a new movie, something classical. Choose a musical. Limited technology. I know that's a difficult one, but it's so important that without everyone's cooperation, if we don't let parents know how much technology is doing to their children's screen time, and I'm not a Luddite, I do agree a lot of technology is good, but the amount of screen time children have is really impacting their ability to appreciate the classics. You go to a beach and there are children on iPads instead of playing in the water. That's very detrimental to that. Then none of this is going to work if that's the environment at home. And that's really important. And of course the culture of service, knowing that it's not about the grades, it's about why they're being educated. So first and foremost, the parents, that's the most important thing, the home life, that needs to be dealt with. The second area, which we've already had a good summary, is the virtue education. So educating for character. It starts with the lived example of parents and teachers and educators, those around them, and needs to be explicit. So I'll repeat a little bit of what Paul said earlier this morning. One of the reasons why we have a rose on our logo and the little rosebud for the kinder is because for a rose to be able to bloom, it needs to be pruned sometimes, and it needs to be guided and nurtured. So the same way, children are not born virtuous. I know a lot of the time there's an attitude that children are born virtuous. We know that's not the case. So they need to explicitly be taught the virtues. So we have timetabled into our schedule once a week. There's a virtue lesson. We call it motto. And from foundation, their foundation year, maybe the virtue is justice, and they're learning about justice in the home. So their motto might be, this week, your goal is to pack away straight away, because that's justice for your family. So very practical, very simple, and I'm going to show you an example of how that's broken down. And what's really important, though, is that we need to focus on freedom. So the children, when they're learning these virtues explicitly and putting them into practice, we do need to have a level of trust. You need to give your children opportunities, and parents need to give children opportunities, and teachers need to give students opportunities to use their freedom and potentially abuse that freedom, obviously in a safe way. It's better to be fooled by children sometimes at school. So if you need to trust your students to do something, you're putting a level of trust, and they need to make decisions and use their freedom. That's part of the virtue education. We're controlling everything around them. They're not learning to make those choices. Also in the middle of the world. Now, we have a lot of excellent Christian resources, especially when it comes to our English program, but not everything needs to be Christian in a classical education, and because they need to learn to discern right and wrong in a secular world. So if we do find that children they're very black and white, and we deal a lot with little ones, so it's just interesting to see them grow up. Our eldest grade being grade 7, we're just still learning as well with them. Sometimes if you give them too many Christian resources, they start to think anything Christian is good, anything not Christian, so a book that's not written by a Christian is not good. And can you see there's a problem there? When they get to university and that it's all, they don't know how to discern themselves. So giving them a variety of resources in an age-appropriate way that are still is moral. It's not about exposing them to things that are not moral, but helping them discern right and wrong in a very practical way. And the key virtues, which I won't go into, but ones that we've really thought about that kids need to learn, the earlier the better. Sincerity, so lying has to be an absolute no-no. Loyalty, trust, as I said, friendship, refinement in human relationships, in other words, good manners. So if you are starting a school from scratch, it's really important that you foster that habit of good manners. And if you're a teacher working in a current system and manners are maybe not encouraged at that school, in your own capacity, it's so valuable to just correct gently and to teach children respect, like stand up when the teacher enters the room, basic manners. Optimism, so I think that's really important. Sometimes we can get caught up on all the bad things in the world, but they need to see the good things. So we really make an effort to focus on what is good. Drown evil in an abundance of good. So we're always showing them very positive resources. So even when it comes to some of the cross-curricular priorities, so let's just say the Indigenous Australian elements of the curriculum, showing them all the richness and the beauty of that culture without getting caught up in the politics and the negativity. Otherwise, when they leave school, the narrative is being set by someone else. So we want to set the narrative as something good and positive and show them all the good parts of our culture. And of course, fortitude, temperance, and an eagerness to work well. Okay, how does that work practically? So every term, we focus on a different virtue. So this was our plan this year in 2022. We have one living virtue. So every child across the school, from foundation to high school, sets a weekly goal to grow in that living virtue. So term 1 was respect and responsibility, which comes under justice. So their goal might be hand my homework in, put my bag away, depending on their context. Or it was bigger things like being kind to your parents, using kind words when talking to mum and dad, helping in the home. Then we have a learning virtue for the class. So as a class in the classroom, we work on, in first term it was working with others and working for others. So that was like a classroom goal. So there's a personal goal, a weekly personal goal, and a classroom goal for the whole term. And we'll rotate, under the 4 cardinal virtues, we'll rotate the living virtue and the learning virtue from year to year. So next year we'll likely do sincerity under prudence. So we'll use all the smaller virtues underneath each of the bigger ones. Under justice, we'll focus on friendship. So throughout their lifetime at school, they're getting a very deep understanding of all the virtues in a very practical way. Now, I know that's repeating a little bit of what we heard this morning, but I cannot emphasise enough that without this understanding of the virtues and what work is for, you're not going to get to children reading Homer. You have to start with, helping them develop those habits and learning to be a virtuous person. One thing which I think is really important to note, we have a Catholic education, but we're not a Catholic school. So we do have people of other faiths, and our families of various faiths love this virtue program. It just shows how universal it is and how human it is. Especially for they maybe haven't heard a lot of this before, whereas people who are from a Christian background, maybe they're a bit more familiar. But the families of different backgrounds really love this because it gives them a tool and a framework to help educate the character of their children.
Is that a standalone program?
Yes, this is our program. Yes.
But you do a period a week, or
a period a week.
Okay.
Yeah. And then some homework to do with their parents, which I think the parents get as much from. During the height of lockdown, I can't remember which lockdown. Who knows in Melbourne? One of the virtues, the living virtue, was hope. And it was just coincidental. We had planned it at the start of the year, and the parents, it focused a lot on resilience, which does overlap a little bit with the curriculum. The Victorian curriculum has that focus on resilience, so we incorporated it into our virtue program. And the parents said it was more useful for them than for the children, just focusing on resilience and hope. And then the lockdown kept going, so I don't know if the hope was tested a little bit after that. We'll just talk about the final route structure before I go into the practicalities about the curriculum, striving for excellence. So just to repeat, children need to see education as an act of service. So they're developing their talents to serve the world. And I have heard the mistake sometimes of, what do we need this for? I'm sure every teacher has heard that expression before. Why do I need to know this? So it's teaching them that education is something bigger than themselves, but they need to choose to embrace this with freedom. The more we show them how much we love learning, how passionate we are about education, the more we give them beautiful, optimistic texts, as opposed to, I think in a lot of schools there's a lot of, I call it radicalisation of children. So these are all the things in the world you should be outraged by. That's not inspiring. So instead we can say these are all the things that you can be encouraged by, and even if you'll never be a writer or a historian, we can be fascinated by this. Even if you'll never be an engineer or a mathematician, isn't it amazing the order that the world is in? And just teach that love. So they need to make that free decision. We can't make them love education, but we can demonstrate it as much as possible. And we do find that PARED students, there's that rocky, yes, year 9-10 stage, which I've seen in Sydney, which is universal, but by and large, PARED students understand this because we've worked so hard to teach them that education is not about them. It's not about their VCE or HSE mark. It's something bigger. So we need to emulate that ourselves. So once we have those roots, we can start talking about what parts of the classical education, of a classical education works with the Victorian curriculum. So there's a few assumptions I need to make. I would love to have longer to talk more about this, but I think in some ways I'm probably preaching to the converted. But just to reiterate, these are, I guess, addressing pedagogy. It's very clear to me, just from what I've seen, and I might be wrong, happy to be corrected, that a classical approach is not compatible with the open plan classrooms that you see at the moment. I'm sure there are ways you can work that in, and I'd love to hear from teachers with more experience in that system, so I'm happy to be corrected on that. But what I've seen in practice from our model is that, yes, so children require knowledge, and the knowledge as a means to greater things, not knowledge in itself. So we want them to be doing hands-on activities and all those wonderful things you see in open plan classrooms. We want them to be doing that, but that's only after they've acquired knowledge and acquired structure. They need to know that there's truth. They thrive in a structured learning environment. All our classrooms are traditionally set up, not in a stifling way. They're beautiful, but you know, the desks are facing the teacher, there's a structure on the wall, there's a timetable, and even from prep or kindergarten, as some of the states would say kindergarten, the kids are very aware of what they need to do to be successful in the day. They say, I need to do this, then I need to do this, and that empowers them, to use that generic word, that empowers them to take charge of their learning. The other children need building blocks. So before they can read Treasure Island or those beautiful classical texts, they need to decode, they need phonics, they need to understand grammar, they need to understand number before they can do something like robotics and all this cool coding. You know, that's not the end point. No, they need to understand number, they need to understand an algorithm. So they need these building blocks first, and then you open them up to the memorable opportunities such as robotics and everything else. So we really focus on building blocks, especially in the early years, and that requires patience, a lot of patience. It requires parents to be listening to the children read decodable readers and all these uninteresting stories, but it's just teaching them the bigger picture is coming. And this goes across all disciplines. So in music, they do a program called Kodai, which is the building blocks of music, and it does mean sometimes they're singing nursery rhymes and things with repetitive beats because they're learning the structure of music. And sometimes we can say, oh, we want them to be singing Handel's Messiah. It's like, okay, but they need the building blocks first. So very big focus on building blocks. I'm going to show you very briefly an insight into one of our classrooms. It's a Spalding lesson. I won't show you the whole thing. Those familiar with the school, it was a few years ago. Oh, it doesn't seem to be showing up. That's okay. If I have time at the end, I'll demonstrate it. But a Spalding lesson is a phonics-based program which we use for English, and this isn't an advertisement for Spalding. I'm just using this as an example. So what we've decided is we even from foundation, we're focusing on these building blocks, but we are beginning to teach them. They're doing classical text studies from prep now. Originally we started it later, but we found that there are some classics. We've started a great books program, and every classroom in our school has at least the teacher reading to them a beautiful, great book. So every day the kids will sit down and they're reading a beautiful story. Then they're doing a text response, and I'm going to show you some samples from our foundation students in term 2, and you can see how far ahead they would be for those who are familiar with kindergarten or foundation students in other schools. Poetry, they do poetry from foundation, so they are writing their own poems. I walked into a prep class the other day, and you know, they were very simple, but the teacher was reading them some examples of poems and they were giving it a go. So it's never too early to teach them this because they've already got that strong foundation with Spalding. They do grammar. I know grammar is out of fashion, but we have a really strong emphasis on grammar, especially from grade 2, but even from prep. And what we find is that the first reaction is, oh, grammar's boring. But the children actually love it. When they realise that they can unpack a text and identify correct grammar, we have a little activity where we give the preps in grade 1s a fake student's page of writing, and they have to correct the grammar, and they take it very seriously. So we make up a name, this is Abigail's text, and they correct everything for her, and they're very thorough with their grammar. We don't teach for NAPLAN, I want to emphasise that. However, when we get our NAPLAN results, our grammar is completely off the charts. It just shows how that's not a skill that's taught anymore, and the minimum standard must be pretty low. I mean, if we're completely off the charts and we're not academically selective. So even our students with dyslexia, with learning difficulties, we have the whole range of challenges that any school would have. Even those students are off the charts when it comes to these skills. Just shows that they can do it, but we expect that they can't. So we're setting a very low bar for kids in other contexts. So there's a lot of reading and writing for enjoyment. I'm going to show you a case study of something we're doing called the Big Write, which is to teach children to write for enjoyment. But I just want to mention that our history, art and music is integrated with English. So when students are studying the ancient world, they'll do in history, they'll do the Trojan War text in English, they'll do a pottery unit in art, they'll have exposure to ancient music in their music class. So we have to work really hard, especially in the high school, because there's so much to cover in high school, but we have a lot of collaboration so that we make sure these units are all integrated. And that helps us really engage in that more classic approach. We also start Latin in grade 7. I'd love to start it earlier, but I was talking before about difficulty finding teachers in the classics. So I haven't even thought about Greek yet because I don't know how I would find staff for that. But they also do philosophy in grade 7 as well. So that's building on the virtue education. They're now ready for philosophy. It was really great. I went to a debate with our Year 6 class not long ago, and one of the girls quoted Aristotle in her debate, which was kind of unusual, but it's just good to see they've got that exposure there. Not many Year 6s would know to quote Aristotle. So this is our case study. So this is merely an example to show you what happens when you focus on the building blocks and what the children are able to achieve, and then, as a consequence, what they're able to respond to. So they're able to respond to a classical education because the building blocks are there. So it's our Year 2 classroom. We found that the texts in the NAPLAN, so there's always a writing component in NAPLAN, and they're pretty basic. So you'd get a prompt, you write a narrative, or you write it persuasive. It's very boring to teach that. It's not interesting, it's not that engaging. They do need to learn how to write properly, but we thought, how can we make this a little bit more meaningful? So we've created a fortnightly Big Write. The children get a prompt that they take home, the whole school gets the same prompt. The idea is they talk about it over the family dinner table, they talk about what they're going to write about, they brainstorm ideas, and then they arrive on Friday and they write. So this is one that we did in week 3 of term 2, the Lost Teddy. So they vary in complexity. This is a very simple one for the sake of the presentation. So they took this picture home on Monday and then they came to school on Friday. So this was our prep. So this is in their second term of school, what they were able to write. We also focus on handwriting, so you can probably tell we actually teach them how to write properly. We don't do iPads or anything like that because we want them, it's the only time in their life they can learn to write properly, so we focus on it. So I'll read this one. The Lost Teddy. Once upon a time, there was a teddy. So there's spelling mistakes, but it's logical. You can actually read it. There was a teddy. He was sad. The kid lost him. Did he lose him? The teddy is not happy so much. The end. I mean, for prep term 2, sorry, I should have blocked out the name, but it's your daughter Emma. Sorry, I made an effort to block the names, but I just realised. Very good handwriting. I have to tell her she was on display.
Funny.
This little one here, the Lost Teddy, was on the road, the kid was sad, he slept alone, pray to God to help. So pray to ask God to help. So this, I'm not sure who is a primary teacher here, but for term 2 foundation, this is pretty extraordinary. And this is because we've had that patience in term 1 to just build the blocks slowly, give them a quiet environment. By contrast, I've been to a few schools because I want to make sure I see as much as possible using different methods. I've been to a few schools with open classrooms just to observe. And I sat in on a writing task with a grade 1-2 class. There were 3 classes in the same space, and this isn't a reflection of the open classroom itself, it's just more partly the environment, partly the standards. And they would have had the same amount of time as the preps had for this task, and I would have been lucky to see 3 lines from the grade 1 and 2 class. So whereas our grade 1s, this is grade 1. So they're writing full pages in a very short space of time. They even had time to draw pictures, which was quite amazing. As they get older, because we have exposed them to different types of literature, so this would have been, we get them from grade 5 to type it. Not my ideal, but they do have to type NAPLAN, so they need to know how to type. And because we don't have much technology in our school, the way we've chosen to teach that skill is once a fortnight they type their big write. So this student in probably grade 5, I think, chose to do a poem. And for grade 5, that's quite a long and beautiful poem. The use of language as well. I mean, things like "I'm so forlorn," they're using language like that because they're reading and because we're reading to them. So you can see the build-up to that. So if we want them to be able to access all the wonders of the classics, they need these building blocks first, and that's why we've chosen not to have the more open classroom. We've chosen to have structure, patience, and just take them through slowly. Then I'm aware I'm going over time, so I'm going to be really quick. I'm going to give you another example in mathematics, science and technology. So we once again focus on teacher-led instruction. We have textbooks, which I didn't realise were so controversial, but we do. We only do the hands-on implementation after we've really understood that we can see the children understood the task. So we decided to, the curriculum at the moment has very minimal problem solving in the early years. So wanting to develop their critical thinking skills, we decided to dedicate a lesson a week just on problem solving, which I was going to show you briefly, but I'm aware we're out of time. I'll just summarise it very simply. What we ask the children to do, this is important for the early years, so this would be probably grade 1, I think. They get a problem. We have taught them the different strategies they can use. They show us how they can solve the problem, they choose a strategy, and then they explain their learning. So they tell us what they've, because we want to see that they have thought through their problems. So they're not just playing maths games, which is important, and we are a big fan of that, but they're actually showing us how they've come up with their problems. After they've got these foundations, they can play maths games and do everything else. Okay, so I'm going to move a bit quickly now. I just want to give you some examples of how we, having that foundation set up, how we bear fruit and give them that classical education. So art and culture. We get our students to do everything. they do art, specialist art from an early age. They do poetry. The video down the bottom, I won't play it, but our students, several of our students came first in the independent schools poetry competition in the different year levels, and that's a performance piece. We take them to the galleries. There's some of their ancient art. They do debating, and there's our choir. Bit of a shameless plug, our choir came first in East Edford this year. So you can see that the building blocks work. So everything we do, the children do well, not because we're aiming for the glory of it, but because it's working. It's a testament that it's working. So creative thinking and innovation. Now, what we see is that a lot of the time you see wonderful pictures of kids working hard and and that they look happy, and that's wonderful. So we have that too, but this only comes after these the drilling and the building up these blocks. So we've had students coding. We took them to the local TAFE. They were able to play with virtual reality. They were coding to move a robot. They're doing that, but these are just extra things. These are memorable opportunities to consolidate their learning. So it's one of the, we can give them these opportunities and they understand what they're doing because we've worked on the building blocks. We have a very, very strong sporting culture. Sport is really important. I have heard some feedback sometimes is that if sport detracts from reading, or it's the opposite. I really think if they can apply themselves in a physical sense, then they're really applying those virtues that they've learnt, and it clears their mind. So we do have exams from grade 5. It's an important discipline for them in terms of their study habits. So, and we have personal mentoring. Oh dear, I just realised we have Trent's lovely daughter there getting mentored. So just to make sure that their personal goals are on track. So they need to be doing sport, they need to be doing exams, they need to be doing everything, but after the building blocks are set. And finally, the project-based learning. So we do want them to be able to undertake projects independently. So we can actually let the kids go off and do things on their own with trust, because we've given them as much foundation as possible. We don't need to supervise their every movement. So because of that, we are achieving the skills that the Victorian curriculum sets out, this project-based learning and independence, but our pathway is taking that classical approach, and as a result, we really think the kids are soaring far above their counterparts at other schools. So I'll leave it there. I know I just spoke your ears off, but I guess the take-home, that seems to be the term of the day, the take-home is that the state curriculum, in our case anyway, the Victorian state curriculum, gives you scope to do all of this. But you need to be dedicated to do it from the ground up and get the parents on board, and not underestimate the importance of virtues in that structure. So
fabulous, fabulous. No, that was it. Great, fabulous to get a practical sort of view of what can be done with a school, and all of those examples are very enlightening. Questions? Diff?
I was just wondering what you do or how you handle the requirement to teach technology in the really early years.
Yeah, so we do a technology intensive. So we'll do a lot. You can teach a lot of the digital technology curriculum. At least I'm familiar with the Victorian curriculum. I think it's the same. I think it's based on the national curriculum. You can teach a lot of it without screens. So understanding how to code, understanding sequencing patterns, that's all part of the digital technology curriculum. And then we do an intensive. So normally we would get, what we have been doing is getting another company to come in and do like a 4-week or 6-week intensive. But they bring the technology, they do the activity, and then they take it away. So we have no devices in the classroom at all. We are looking at investing in it. I went to a digital tech conference not long ago, and there is a whole curriculum you can purchase which starts with no screens until grade 2, and it's physically putting together the algorithms, and that covers the whole digital technology outcome. So I'm looking into investing in that, but in the meantime we've got this intensive structure. And it's good because they're creating something. So with this project, it's a 4-week project, and they're creating something, so they can see themselves as creators of technology, not just using it to replace a book.
Peter?
Mary, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I work in a classical liberal think tank, and some of my colleagues get very agitated because I've got great concerns about meritocracy and the culture that it espouses, that you get what you deserve, and if you don't get it, you don't deserve it. And that meritocracy fosters a particular view of success, which is driven around or geared to attainment, and if you don't attain, if you don't fail, but you certainly you've achieved less. My question to you is, to what extent do you think the Parrot system and your school redefines what success means for children?
It's interesting you say that. We recently in the district level athletics and the cross country, our school and Trent School as well completely dominated, got every ribbon, and it was a bit embarrassing. And I actually said, I can't wait for them to go to the next level and lose, because this isn't good character development. This isn't very good character development. I guess that's just a side note. I think what we see as a success for the children leaving the school is not all of this, even though I've just demonstrated a lot of their successes, but it's being the same person wherever they are, so living with integrity. So what we teach children is that it's more important that they've lived with integrity, that they've lived the virtues, than what medal they receive at the end.
Sure, that's right.
So I took our Year 7s to a netball match not long ago. Apparently one of the other teams was playing dirty, doing a bit of dirty talking and swearing, and were being a bit rough, and the girls came to me a bit upset, and they said, oh, they put us off, like we could have won, but they were really, and I said, I'd rather you lose and do the right thing than play dirty like them. So it's just taking it back to, we'd rather they be the same person and do the right thing in every situation, even when no one's looking.
Thank you, I think that's really important.
Excellent. Down the back.
Thank you, Mary, for your delightful presentation. Mary, the classical education movement focuses on the 7 liberal arts. Throughout the presentation, I heard a lot about grammar. My question to you is, what about logic and rhetoric? I was wondering, you mentioned, for example, poetry. Do you get the students to actually recite the poem as an example? Because I feel that if we're going to be really classically minded, we need to also not forget those 2 liberal arts, logic and rhetoric.
Yes. So, yes and no. So we're not a full classical education school. I think that's important to remember. We're not following the tenets of classical education. We're using what is working within the current model. So that's an important distinction. That being said, when we teach poetry, we're teaching rhetoric. When we teach debating, we're teaching logic. So once again, and this sounds like I'm just selling the school, I'm not, but I think this is a good example. When we took our kids through debating, like preparing for debating, took them through logic and how to make an argument, also enlightened by what they've learnt in philosophy, they know how to frame an argument. When they went to a debating competition, they won every debate, because they've obviously, that classical training has come through. So while we're not following it directly, when we teach a certain element, when we teach poetry, we teach debating, we're using that classical basis to enrich it. So I think it's, as I said at the beginning, it's the Victorian curriculum enriched with elements of the classical education. But in terms of ticking every box, no, we don't pretend to do that.
We're running sort of overtime a bit, but
Sorry,
that was
that's my
excellent.
fault.
No, it was fabulous, as I said, to get a practical sort of concrete understanding. And Fiona, we've kind of moved from that abstract sort of policy level, which is vital that we understand it, to a school-based example of how you might implement it. And so I'm glad I thought of doing that.
Just so on the back.
Yeah. Just told Peter Cooper and everyone. So lunch, let's